Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal in the precise moment when the truth came crashing down. Moments before what was meant to be her wedding, Willow stood paralyzed by the devastation unraveling before her eyes. The air inside the chapel turned suffocating, thick with whispers, stares, and a growing sense of betrayal. For weeks, Willow had battled an inner storm of suspicion, hoping desperately that her anxious thoughts were nothing more than the echoes of past traumas. But when Curtis, with a grave expression and hesitant voice, leaned in to quietly inform her that Drew had slept with Nina during the previous summer, at a time when she and Drew were still together, her entire world shattered. It wasn't just infidelity, it was humiliation, a sickening betrayal from two people she had trusted with every fragile piece of her heart. The pristine white of her wedding dress, once a symbol of hope and renewal, suddenly mocked her. She felt exposed, ridiculous, and broken. Without saying a word, she removed her engagement ring, then one by one, the carefully constructed layers of her bridal look, veil, lipstick, mascara, until nothing remained but raw grief and fury. She walked out of the church like a ghost slipping through the ruins of her own life. Drew remained at the altar, stiff with disbelief, watching the guests murmur and shift in their seats, some pretending not to notice, others too fascinated to look away. He followed her, driven by panic and guilt, begging her to stop and talk to him. But when he finally caught up to her, Willow's eyes had hardened into something he no longer recognized. They were hollow, drained of all affection, of all illusions. She looked at him not with heartbreak, but with contempt, like one would look at a stranger who had stolen their soul. Drew pleaded for forgiveness, throwing out excuses, promises, and half-truths, but none of it mattered anymore. In that moment, Willow's heart wasn't simply broken, it was beyond repair, burned to ash by a betrayal so deep that it rewrote the meaning of trust. Drew, unable to accept rejection and public humiliation, began to unravel. What began as guilt mutated into bitterness, then vengeance. He told himself that Willow had weaponized morality against him, had made him appear weak and dishonorable in front of the entire town. In his twisted logic, he believed she had destroyed him first, so he would return the favor with interest. He targeted the most vulnerable part of her life, her connection to Daisy. In an act of ruthless calculation, Drew compiled evidence of Willow's past transgressions, audio recordings, surveillance images, and witness accounts, all pointing to the time she secretly took Daisy without Sasha's legal consent. The materials were sent anonymously to the Port Charles Police Department, triggering an immediate investigation. Media outlets seized the story, plastering headlines like "Former Nurse Accused of Child Abduction" across every screen. Willow, once celebrated for her perseverance and devotion, was now demonized by the same public that had once pitied her. The fallout was swift and brutal. Willow was suspended from her position at the hospital, forced to surrender all contact rights with her children, and publicly ridiculed in tabloids that once adored her. Her reputation, the one thing she had clung to as evidence of her worth, was annihilated. Drew, meanwhile, played the part of the uninvolved ex-fiancé, keeping his hands clean while smirking quietly in board meetings and public functions. He watched from the shadows as Willow sank lower and lower, confident that his revenge was complete. But Nina, whose hands were not clean in the collapse of Willow's life, found herself repulsed by what Drew had done. Though she had once been Drew's accomplice in betrayal, she couldn't stomach the cruelty he unleashed upon her daughter. For all her faults, Nina had never wanted this. The cold, methodical dismantling of Willow's life was more than she could endure. Her guilt boiled into fury, and she severed all ties with Drew. Then, determined to make him pay, she quietly began building her own campaign of retribution. She hired a team of investigators and attorneys to unearth Drew's financial records and dealings from his pre-reform days, times when he had been involved in shadowy investment schemes and laundered political donations through shell foundations. Documents were unearthed, testimonials collected, and slowly, Nina assembled a case damning enough to get federal prosecutors interested. At the same time, Nina reached out to Sasha, the silent third party in this long-standing tragedy. Sasha had buried a husband, mourned a child, and yet somehow still stood tall. She deserved to know the truth, not just about Willow's desperation, but about Drew's manipulation. Nina confessed everything and proposed a truce born not of convenience but of shared pain. Together, two women wronged in different ways, began laying the groundwork for a public reckoning that would not only dismantle Drew's image but expose his pattern of using emotional wounds as leverage. Meanwhile, Willow vanished. With nowhere left to turn, she retreated from society entirely. In a modest apartment on the outskirts of Port Charles, she lived in silence, away from flashing cameras and judgmental eyes. Her world was reduced to long nights of restless guilt, fragmented memories, and moments of terrifying clarity. She no longer knew who she was. The mirror reflected a woman stripped of motherhood, love, and purpose. She stopped contacting Michael. She didn't answer calls from Carly. She couldn't face her children, not when she still carried the shame of having failed them in ways that went beyond the courtroom. Yet, through that solitude, something new began to stir, not justification, but a purpose. Willow realized she could no longer live in hiding, not when Daisy still existed in a world where people like Drew were allowed to roam freely, pretending to be heroes. She began documenting her own side of the story. Not to clear her name, but to protect Daisy from a future where truth was always rewritten by the louder voice. She gathered evidence, found former friends willing to testify about Drew's manipulation and abuse, and slowly began preparing for a return not of vengeance, but of defense. She would not let herself be remembered as the woman who stole a child, but as the woman who stood against a system built to protect powerful men like Drew at the cost of everyone else's dignity. In the end, when Drew was finally arrested, his offshore accounts frozen, his political ambitions crumbling, he stood alone. The courtroom was packed with witnesses, journalists, and former allies who had finally seen through his carefully constructed lies. It was Willow, no longer timid and silenced, who took the stand and told her truth. Not just about the betrayal, not just about Daisy, but about how one man's refusal to accept consequence nearly destroyed her life. Her words echoed through the courtroom, reminding everyone that silence breeds injustice, and that even a woman crushed by shame can rise when the only alternative is surrender. And Nina, watching from the gallery, did not cry. She simply nodded, knowing her daughter had finally found her voice. When Nina Reeves formally filed charges against Drew Kane for abuse of power and falsification of charity records, she did not just ignite a scandal. She initiated a seismic shift in Port Charles's social and political landscape. What began as whispered rumors quickly morphed into documented truth. Legal filings became public record, revealing a staggering web of financial manipulation involving Drew's nonprofit initiatives. The pristine image he had cultivated for years, a philanthropic leader, war hero, and aspiring public servant, crumbled in a matter of days as forensic auditors uncovered trail after trail of forged grant approvals, misappropriated donor funds, and charitable donations funneled into personal offshore accounts. Suddenly, people began to realize the Drew they knew was a carefully curated illusion. Board members and donors who had once championed his vision quickly distanced themselves, citing lack of transparency and newly discovered discrepancies. Organizations quietly erased his name from press kits and internal newsletters. At first, there were hushed apologies and reassurances that everything could be explained, but as Nina's legal team produced spreadsheet after spreadsheet, email chain after email chain, the silence grew deafening. What made Nina's move even more potent was the timing, just months before Drew was set to announce his official campaign for state office. His team had already started courting endorsements and building alliances. But those relationships quickly dissolved once his former associates realized their own names could be pulled into the vortex of legal jeopardy. Even Carly Spencer, once a staunch supporter and personal confidant of Drew, began to publicly hedge her comments. The Carly of a year ago might have defended him to her last breath, but the Carly of today knew when a ship was sinking. She issued a carefully worded statement, acknowledging that serious questions had been raised and that she would cooperate fully with any official inquiry. But the most devastating blow wasn't from the media or the courts, it came from the federal government. The FBI, having quietly monitored Drew's financial dealings for years, used Nina's complaint as the final catalyst to take action. Agents raided Drew's corporate offices and personal residence, seizing hard drives, financial ledgers, encrypted communications, and burner phones. Every account linked to Drew was frozen under emergency statute. His assets, including luxury properties and investments, were flagged as potential instruments of fraud and money laundering. Overnight, the man who once towered over Port Charles as an untouchable force found himself trapped inside a cage of his own design. And then came Willow. Not as the fragile woman shattered by public humiliation, but as someone who had endured silence long enough. Her return was not announced with media fanfare. She did not seek the spotlight. Instead, she stepped in front of the town with the steady grace of someone who had nothing left to lose. In a public address held in the atrium of General Hospital, once the epicenter of both her personal and professional life, Willow spoke not with vengeance, but with clarity. She acknowledged her own missteps, especially in her handling of Daisy's custody situation, and she extended a sincere apology to Sasha for the emotional pain caused. It was a moment of vulnerability, but also one of extraordinary strength. Then, she pivoted. Willow revealed audio clips and text messages dating back months, some of which had been previously deleted but recently recovered through digital forensics. In those messages, Drew could be heard subtly coercing her, framing situations in such a way that he always emerged as her savior, her sole pillar of strength. He used her trauma, her fear of losing her children, her insecurity about motherhood, as leverage to gain control over her decisions. Willow presented documentation showing how Drew deliberately isolated her from trusted friends, suggested that Michael was manipulating her, and positioned himself as the only one she could rely on. She laid bare how this manipulation culminated in the choices that led her down a path she no longer recognized. These revelations, bolstered by Nina's federal complaint, shook the community to its core. The narrative had shifted. Drew was no longer a victim of romantic fallout or a casualty of political sabotage, he was a predator, emotionally and financially, whose reach extended far beyond one failed relationship. Community members began to question whether his involvement in other initiatives, such as veterans charities and education foundations, were built on similar lies. Drew's reputation, already on life support, was extinguished completely when Nina's attorneys released a detailed timeline cross-referencing his foreign travel with suspicious fund transfers. The implication was clear: not only had Drew stolen money, but he had potentially engaged in international crimes. And then came the reckoning. During a high-profile charity gala held in General Hospital's West Wing, ironically themed, Integrity in Action, federal agents entered through the front entrance with a sealed arrest warrant. With cameras rolling and guests in formal attire holding champagne flutes mid-toast, Drew was approached, handcuffed, and read his rights. His expression, once smug and untouchable, turned pale and vacant. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just allowed himself to be escorted out in front of the town he had once held in his pocket. The man who had crafted an empire from manipulation, gaslighting, and charm now stood exposed in front of every person who had once believed in him. But while Drew was escorted into the back of a black SUV and driven into the legal abyss, Willow stood just outside the building under the hospital's stone archway, holding Daisy close to her chest. Her eyes followed the vehicle not with bitterness, but with a calm resolution. She had lost everything, her reputation, her career, her peace, but she had reclaimed something more valuable, her agency. Her truth. She had faced down a man who tried to rewrite her narrative, and she had emerged standing. No longer the passive victim of Drew's emotional tyranny, Willow had become a beacon for those who had been quietly silenced by powerful manipulators. And Nina, watching nearby from the sidelines, remained still. She didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She knew the fight wasn't over, not for Drew, not for Willow, not for herself. But in that moment, as the community began to murmur with renewed understanding, Nina knew her daughter had done something extraordinary. She had faced the machinery of systemic betrayal and stopped it in its tracks. In doing so, Willow reminded Port Charles, and perhaps even herself, that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its voice. And when it does, it burns through every lie like fire through paper. The story of Drew, Willow, and Nina is far more than a tragic love triangle. It is a harrowing epic of betrayal, redemption, and the dark underbelly of emotional manipulation masked by public virtue. Beneath its surface, this saga stands as a brutal indictment of compromised morality, the dangers of unchecked power, and the subtle yet catastrophic ways in which love can be weaponized. It is a cautionary tale about how lies, no matter how carefully concealed, will always corrode the foundations of trust, and how even those who fall hardest can, through pain and reckoning, rise from the ashes stronger than before. Drew's calculated descent from celebrated philanthropist to disgraced criminal was not just the fall of a man, it was the exposure of an entire system that had enabled his deception. For years, he maneuvered through the upper echelons of Port Charles society, cloaking himself in titles, causes, and carefully curated appearances. He had been perceived as the model of redemption, a man who had overcome adversity to become a protector of the vulnerable. But that image was a facade, and behind it lurked a master manipulator who knew exactly how to twist hearts and leverage pain. His betrayal of Willow was not just infidelity, it was a profound psychological ambush. He invaded her sense of safety, gaslit her into dependency, and then, when spurned, destroyed her with surgical precision. He weaponized her trauma and used it to crush her dignity in the court of public opinion. For many, he was a villain only once the legal system intervened. But for Willow, he had been eroding her spirit long before the headlines caught up. And yet, in this darkness, there was Nina, flawed, impulsive, often volatile, but ultimately, a mother. For all her misjudgments, Nina's motivations were rooted in love, however misguided they may have been. When she realized the extent of Drew's cruelty, not only to Willow but also to everyone he had manipulated, she chose to act. Her decision to expose Drew, despite the personal risk and potential backlash, marked a profound moral pivot. It was not about revenge, it was about justice. Her transformation from passive enabler to fierce protector reminded everyone that the line between sinner and savior is not always clear, and that redemption often begins with a single courageous choice to confront the truth. Willow, however, is where this story finds its most human and inspiring core. Her journey from victim to warrior was not born out of rage but of resilience. For so long, she had clung to the idea that forgiveness was synonymous with healing, that to be good, she must endure. But in the rubble of her ruined reputation, she discovered a deeper truth, that forgiveness, when forced, becomes a quiet form of self-betrayal. She had allowed herself to be broken in the name of love, and when that love betrayed her, she had blamed herself. It was only in isolation, stripped of her roles as mother, partner, and nurse, that Willow began to see clearly. The light she was searching for had never vanished. It had simply been buried beneath years of guilt, fear, and manipulation. In the end, Willow's greatest act of strength was not in defeating Drew through legal channels or reclaiming her public image. It was in reclaiming herself. She faced the world, admitted her mistakes, exposed the truth, and in doing so, broke free from the cycle of silence that so many women in her position are trapped within. Her courage became a mirror to others, a reminder that pain does not have to end in destruction, and that scars can become symbols of survival. As Nina continues her quiet war to dismantle the remnants of Drew's false empire, she does so not only for her daughter but for every woman who has ever been manipulated, silenced, or dismissed. She has learned that motherhood is not about protecting your child from every wound, but about standing beside her when the world turns cruel, and helping her find her voice again. The story of Drew, Willow, and Nina, then, is not merely a personal drama, it is a resurrection. It is about the reclamation of truth in a world addicted to lies. It is about how dignity, though stripped away, can be restored. And above all, it is about how even in the aftermath of devastation, when trust is shattered, love is corrupted, and reputations are destroyed, there remains within us a quiet, relentless strength. A strength that waits patiently beneath the rubble, ready to rise when we are finally ready to choose ourselves. Willow has made that choice. And in doing so, she has proven that the human spirit, though battered, is never beyond repair. Her story is a reminder that light is not the absence of darkness, but the resolve to shine despite it. And in the end, perhaps that is what true redemption looks like, not perfection, but the courage to keep walking forward, even when every step is haunted by the shadow of who we used to be. Certainly. Here's a detailed and emotionally resonant concluding paragraph in English for the narrative you've developed. In the end, the ruins left behind by Drew's ambition, Willow's shattered innocence, and Nina's painful awakening were not just symbols of destruction, they were the foundation upon which something unshakable could be built. Out of betrayal came truth. Out of silence came voice. And out of suffering came strength. Port Charles would never forget the scandal that exposed its golden sun, but more importantly, it would remember the woman who rose from his shadow and reclaimed her identity not with vengeance, but with clarity. Willow no longer needed to be defined by her mistakes or by the men who betrayed her.